Imagine this for a moment. Two presidents stand on opposite sides of the world. One represents a nation struggling with inflation insecurity and a generation desperate for opportunity. The other represents the most powerful immigration system on earth. Now imagine that without a single word spoken between them, a decision is made that quietly changes the lives of millions of ordinary people. That decision is called a visa bond. In recent days, a new U.S. policy has begun sending shockwaves across parts of Africa, the Caribbean, Asia, and South America. Under this rule, applicants for a simple B1, B2 visitor or business visa from certain countries may now be required to deposit $5,000, $10,000, or even $50,000 upfront before they are allowed to travel. The money is refundable, yes, but only if the traveler leaves the United States on time without a single mistake. This is not a travel ban, but it may be something more unsettling. For a retired American watching this from home, it might sound like a technical immigration adjustment, a bureaucratic safeguard, just another policy detail buried in fine print. But for a teacher, a shop owner, or a grandmother hoping to attend a family event abroad, this policy feels very different. It feels like a quiet message: your passport is now considered a risk. And here's the uncomfortable question no one wants to ask out loud. Does this policy mean that international travel is slowly becoming a privilege only for the wealthy, the powerful, and the politically connected? For families, the numbers become staggering. For trust, the damage runs even deeper. Because when a nation requires financial guarantees instead of good faith, it signals something far bigger than visa compliance. It signals how power judges countries not by their people, but by their systems. Tonight, we're not here to shout, we're not here to blame, and we're certainly not here to beg. We're here to understand what this policy really says about global power, national dignity, and the invisible line between security and humiliation. Because the world does not respond to tears, it responds to structure. What do you think? Is this policy a reasonable safeguard or a warning sign of a deeper global divide? Please share your thoughts in the comments. And subscribe if you believe that the truth matters more than access and dignity matters more than permission. To understand why this policy has caused such alarm, we need to slow down and examine exactly what has changed and what has not. Because at first glance, the announcement sounds technical, almost harmless. But its real impact only becomes clear when you follow the process step by step. Under the new rule announced by United States applicants from 38 selected countries who apply for a B1, B2 visitor or business visa may now be required to post a financial bond after their visa is approved. This bond is not a fee, it is not a tax. It is a refundable deposit meant to guarantee that the traveler will obey U.S. immigration rules and leave the country on time. The bond amount is not fixed. It comes in three possible tiers: $5,000 for applicants judged to be low risk, $10,000 for those considered medium risk, $50,000 for applicants deemed high risk. The most important detail is this: the decision is made entirely by a U.S. consular officer during the visa interview. There is no appeal process, no negotiation, no explanation required. Two people with the same job, the same income, and the same travel plans could walk into the same embassy on the same day and receive completely different bond decisions. One of the countries affected is Nigeria, with implementation scheduled to begin on January 21, 2026. And while this rule does not ban Nigerians from traveling to the United States, it introduces a powerful new filter, one based not on criminal records or intent, but on perceived national risk. Once a visa is approved and a bond is required, payment must be made directly to the U.S. government through an official pay.gov link provided by the embassy. Applicants are explicitly warned not to use agents or third parties, as scams are already emerging around the policy. A specific form, Form I-352, must be completed only after the consular officer instructs the applicant to do so. Then comes another critical restriction: entry points. Travelers issued a bonded B1, B2 visa may enter the United States only through 3 airports: Boston JFK and New York Washington, D.C. After landing at one of these locations, they may continue onward to their final destination. But travelers are warned to expect additional screening, longer processing times, and possible secondary inspections. Airlines are advising passengers not to book tight connecting flights because delays are not just possible, they are likely. At this stage, many viewers begin to ask the same question: why all this control for a visitor visa? The answer lies in what happens next. When a bonded traveler enters the United States, immigration officers issue an admit until date. This date is stored electronically in the traveler's I-94 record and represents the absolute deadline to leave the country. If the traveler departs on or before that date, the bond becomes eligible for refund. If they overstay even by 1 day, the entire bond is forfeited. There are no partial refunds. There are no grace periods. Worse still, if a traveler attempts to change status, apply for asylum, or otherwise alter their immigration situation, the bond is automatically lost regardless of the outcome of that application. This is where the policy stops being abstract and becomes deeply personal. For a single traveler, $5,000 may already represent years of savings. For a family of 4, the bond requirement is per person. That means a household could be required to deposit $20,000, $40,000, or even $200,000 just to visit the United States temporarily. For many families, that number is not difficult, it is impossible. And this leads us to the heart of the issue. This policy does not ask, "Who are you?" It asks, "Where are you from, and how much can you risk losing?" The consequences of that question are only beginning to unfold. This is the moment where policy stops sounding administrative and starts feeling personal. Because once people understood that the visa bond is charged per person, the conversation shifted almost overnight. What had seemed like a technical safeguard suddenly became a wall, one that many ordinary families could never climb. Imagine a family of 4, a mother, a father, 2 children. If each family member is assessed at the lowest bond level, that household must deposit $20,000 just to visit the United States. If the assessment rises to a medium risk, the amount doubles. At the highest tier, the figure climbs toward $200,000 money that must be paid upfront, locked away, and placed entirely at risk. For many families, that number does not represent inconvenience. It represents everything they have ever saved. This is where the emotional temperature of the issue spikes. The question people begin asking is no longer about visas. It is about fairness. Does this quietly mean that only the wealthy can now travel freely? Does it mean that a passport has become a financial test rather than a legal document? And what happens to children whose only risk is the country they were born into? The reactions across affected countries have been swift and deeply emotional. Social media, radio programs, and community discussions have filled with anger, fear, and disbelief. Many people are not upset because they plan to overstay. They are upset because they are being prejudged, treated as a potential violation before they have even boarded a plane. And then comes the fear that truly drives the panic: losing the bond. Under this policy, there is no margin for error. Overstay by 1 day, the money is gone. Apply to change your status, the money is gone. Seek asylum, even if your claim is genuine, the money is gone. There is no appeal, no discretion, no explanation required. For older viewers watching from the United States, this may recall earlier eras of immigration enforcement times when entire groups were labeled risky not because of individual behavior, but because of collective reputation. The difference now is that the penalty is not exclusion, it is financial exposure. Governments and commentators in affected regions have offered mixed reactions. Some officials urge calm, insisting this is not a ban. Others quietly admit that the policy reflects how powerful countries manage risk, not with empathy, but with leverage. Media outlets have reported the facts, but the emotional reality lives with the people expected to pay. One reaction stands out sharply in comparison. In at least one smaller country, when similar restrictions were imposed, the response was not pleading or explanation. It was reciprocity. Restrictions were mirrored. Diplomatic pressure was applied. Within weeks, the original measures were reversed. That example has fueled a dangerous question elsewhere. Is respect in global politics ever given, or is it only taken? Critics of the bond policy argue that it misunderstands human behavior. They point out that most visa overstays are not acts of defiance. They are acts of desperation. People do not risk everything because they want to break rules. They do it because returning home feels like returning to instability, fear, and economic suffocation. Supporters of the policy respond with a colder logic. They argue that enforcement requires deterrence, that financial guarantees reduce violations, that a nation has the right to protect its borders. Both sides believe they are being realistic. But for the families caught in between, realism feels indistinguishable from punishment. This is the climax of the story, not because of what the policy says on paper, but because of what it says between the lines. It tells millions of people that trust has been replaced by suspicion, and that movement now comes with a price tag few can afford, and once that message is sent, it cannot be unheard. As the initial shock settles, a deeper realization begins to take hold, one that moves beyond visa procedures and into the realm of national consequence. Because policies like the visa bond do not emerge in isolation. They are responses to patterns, reputations, and systems observed over time. For ordinary citizens, the civil impact is immediate and deeply personal. Travel plans are postponed or canceled. Family reunions become financially impossible. Business opportunities quietly disappear. A simple visit, once a matter of paperwork, now demands proof of wealth and tolerance for risk. The result is a widening gap between those who can move freely and those who cannot, not because of wrongdoing, but because of where they come from. This creates a subtle but powerful form of exclusion. Not a ban written in law, but a barrier written in numbers. On the political level, the message is even more uncomfortable. The visa bond policy signals that global trust is no longer extended on goodwill. It is extended on structure, on enforcement, on visible order. In other words, powerful nations are saying, show us your systems, not your intentions. This is where leadership comes into focus. When a country struggles with weak institutions, inconsistent law enforcement, and visible corruption, those failures do not remain internal. They travel. They appear in embassy assessments, intelligence reports, and diplomatic briefings. Month after month, year after year, they accumulate into a reputation, one that no speech or protest can easily erase. For citizens, this creates a bitter contradiction. They are asked to carry the cost of decisions they did not make, under governments they did not design, within systems they cannot control. And yet, from the outside, nations are judged as single units. The individual disappears. The passport becomes the verdict. Some governments respond to such treatment with outrage, accusing foreign powers of discrimination or hidden agendas. Others issue statements calling for fairness and understanding. But history shows that emotional appeals rarely change policy. In global politics, perception follows performance. Power responds to results. There is also a long-term civic consequence that often goes unnoticed: internal trust erosion. When citizens repeatedly face humiliation abroad, confidence at home weakens. Young people begin to believe that success requires escape. Professionals redirect their ambitions outward. The bond between citizen and state frays not because people hate their country, but because they feel it cannot protect their dignity. And yet there is another path, one far less discussed. When nations invest seriously in security, governance, and accountability, the external response changes, not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily. Restrictions ease, assumptions soften, risk assessments shift. This is not idealism. It is pattern recognition. The visa bond policy then becomes a mirror, an uncomfortable one. It reflects how the world interprets internal disorder as external risk. It shows how consequences arrive quietly without negotiation when systems fail to inspire confidence. This does not mean the policy is fair. It does not mean it is humane. But it does mean it is predictable, and that predictability carries a lesson many nations would rather ignore. You cannot demand respect abroad when disorder is visible at home. The consequences of ignoring that lesson are not symbolic. They are financial, they are generational, and they are already being felt by the people least responsible for creating them. From the American perspective, the visa bond policy is framed not as punishment, but as risk management. U.S. officials argue that every nation has the right and responsibility to protect its borders, enforce its laws, and ensure that temporary visitors leave when they are supposed to. In that logic, the bond is simply a financial guarantee, no different from a security deposit on a rental agreement. Supporters of the policy point to data showing visa overstays concentrated among specific countries. They argue that enforcement mechanisms must evolve when traditional screening no longer works. To them, the bond is not a judgment of character, but a tool, one designed to reduce violations without issuing blanket bans that could spark diplomatic backlash. From inside the United States, this reasoning sounds practical, even restrained. There is no mass exclusion, no dramatic announcement, no rhetoric aimed at any particular people, just a quiet recalibration of trust handled by consular officers and enforced through compliance. But when viewed from outside, the message feels very different. Across Africa, parts of Asia, and Latin America, many see the policy as a signal that mobility itself is being weaponized. That the right to move, visit, or do business is increasingly tied to national reputation rather than individual intent. In this view, the bond does not simply measure risk, it assigns it collectively. The global contrast becomes clearer when examining which countries are not on the list. Nations with stronger institutions, lower overstay rates, and more consistent governance face fewer restrictions regardless of income level. This reinforces an uncomfortable truth of international relations: fairness is rarely the standard. Predictability is. History offers useful comparisons. Smaller states that responded to similar measures with quiet diplomacy and internal reform eventually saw restrictions eased. Others chose confrontation, responding with reciprocal visa measures or diplomatic pressure. In a few cases, that strategy worked. In many, it did not. What matters is not the size of a country, but its leverage. From Washington's point of view, leverage comes from data enforcement and outcomes. The U.S. does not respond to outrage alone. It responds to patterns that change. This is not moral judgment, it is bureaucratic reality. For American viewers, especially those who remember earlier decades of global migration, this moment may feel familiar. Immigration policy has always been shaped by fear numbers and political pressure. What is new is the financialization of trust, the idea that compliance can be guaranteed with money when confidence is low. That shift carries consequences beyond visas. It influences how nations interact, how alliances are weighed, and how respect is distributed. When movement requires collateral, relationships become transactional, and when relationships become transactional, dignity becomes conditional. The world is watching how this policy unfolds, not just to see whether overstays decline, but to see what kind of precedent it sets. Because once financial guarantees replace trust, reversing that logic becomes far more difficult. This is not just an American story, it is a global signal. And the signal is clear: power does not wait for explanations, it waits for results. As we step back from the details, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The visa bond policy is not just about immigration control. It is a warning signal, quiet, technical, and deeply consequential. It tells a story about how the modern world assigns trust, how power evaluates risk, and how nations are judged long before individuals ever speak for themselves. This policy did not appear overnight. It is the end result of years of accumulated data, patterns of enforcement failure, and visible disorder that powerful institutions track carefully. When systems weaken, consequences do not always arrive as sanctions or speeches. Sometimes they arrive as procedures, forms, deposits, deadlines, and silent assumptions built into policy. The danger lies in misunderstanding the lesson. If countries respond only with outrage, accusations of discrimination, or emotional appeals, nothing changes. History shows that clearly. Power does not move because it is shamed. It moves when conditions shift, when results become undeniable, when structures replace excuses. For ordinary citizens, this reality feels profoundly unfair, and in many ways it is. People are being asked to pay for systems they did not design, under leaders they did not choose, within institutions they cannot reform alone. Families bear costs that governments created. Children inherit reputations they never earned. But ignoring the warning does not make it disappear. The deeper risk is normalization. When financial barriers replace trust, inequality hardens into policy. Movement becomes privilege. Dignity becomes conditional. And once that framework is accepted, it spreads not just across borders, but across generations. There is, however, a different future available. When nations invest in real security, enforce laws, consistently reduce corruption visibly, and create conditions people no longer need to flee, the external response changes. Not because the world becomes kinder, but because risk assessments shift, restrictions loosen, assumptions soften, respect follows structure. This is not theory. It is pattern. For viewers watching from the United States, this moment offers a chance for reflection as well. Immigration debates often focus on borders and enforcement, but rarely on why desperation persists elsewhere. Policies may manage symptoms, but stability addresses causes. And a world where stability spreads is safer for everyone. So the final question is not just about visas. It is this: do we want a world where movement is governed by fear and money, or one shaped by systems strong enough to earn trust? Because once trust is replaced with deposits reclaiming, it becomes far more difficult. If this discussion challenged the way you see global mobility, please share it. If you believe dignity should never require collateral, leave a comment. And subscribe if you believe the truth matters more than headlines and systems matter more than speeches. The conversation does not end here. In many ways, it is only beginning.